Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this seminar on the rise of Japan's gender diplomacy and gender diplomats. My name is Åsa Malmström-Rognes. I'm the head of the Asia program here at the Institute of International Affairs. And I'm very happy that we have Nancy Snow here joining us for this Stockholm Seminar in Japan. This is the seminar series that we co-organized together with Stockholm University and the European Institute of Japanese Studies at Stockholm School of Economics. And we have had more than 90 seminars in the series. We're getting close to 100. And we're really happy that we have this collaboration with different universities here in the city and UI, and that we can invite speakers to come and talk to us. So this short introduction, I'll hand over to Dr. Stephanie Winkler, who will be moderating the seminar, and she will introduce our speaker and our discussant.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Winkler. I'm very glad you all made it here. I am a lecturer at the Swedish Defence University and a fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, and I specialize in security studies in the Asia-Pacific and specifically also public diplomacy in that area. Today we have Dr. Nancy Snow with us, Emerita Professor of Communications from Cal State Fullerton University, but these days predominantly a Professor of Public Diplomacy, a Distinguished Professor of Public Diplomacy at the Kyoto University of Foreign Studies in Japan, a Fellow at Temple University in Japan, and most important of all, a very prolific writer of more than a dozen books, and also a guest writer on Nikkei Asia. Dr. Snow will give a presentation today on her ongoing research project on rethinking public diplomacy through a gender and feminist lens. And she pays specific attention to Japan in this context. Professor Snow will give a presentation for around 20 minutes or so. And after this, we have our discussant, Dr. Emil Edenborg, lead us through a few questions in response to this. Dr. Edenborg is a political scientist and gender researcher at the Swedish Institute here too, but also at Stockholm University. He studies international relations from a feminist and queer perspectives and has published on Russia's international promotion of traditional family values. Currently, he's researching Swedish development and foreign policy with a focus on LGBTQ rights. So after Dr. Edenborg has finished his discussion, we should have plenty of time for your questions. Just please use the Q&A function at any point during the discussion. If you would also identify yourself quickly, and then we will hopefully be able to call your question. So that's it from me for now. And Nancy, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. What sparked my interest in this intersection of gender with diplomacy with respect to Japan is the result of my own personal reflection on social relations and social hierarchies in a non-native country. As a foreigner on an extended stay as a resident in Japan, specifically an older, white, Western, scholarly US woman, I'm given a lot of privileges and liberties to observe the most basic human relations. My first two travels to Japan occurred in the 90s when I was a government official. One was a youth exchange and the second was a leadership exchange. Even in these short-term visits of a few weeks, I became quickly aware of the invisibility of women in important goings-on in society. The Japanese women in government ministries, I noted on these exchanges, were in the background, not in the foreground. They waited on or served others. The men who were in charge were doing all the explanation, while the women were literally pushing the coffee and tea carts. This was not a working theory I tested. It was just an obvious dichotomy I observed. The foreign correspondent, Carl van Wolferen, observed much more astutely in The Enigma of Japanese Power he wrote the following: in a country where stereotypes are treasured, emphasis on the established proper roles of women is especially notable. It extends to demurely polite deportment, a studied innocent cuteness, a gentle voice 1 octave above the natural voice, and always a nurturing motherly disposition. The modern woman in the world of the salarymen is a cross between Florence Nightingale and the Minister of Finance, as women are almost always totally responsible for household finances. Superior intelligence is a liability for girls and women and must be disguised. Now, let me add, his book was published in 1990, and we can certainly argue that a lot has changed since then. At the time when he published the book, it was not well received, as you might imagine, in Japan. It wasn't until it became an international bestseller that he finally got some meetings with ministry officials. Let me bring it up a little bit more to the recent era. There was a report. I actually, in Tokyo, went to a briefing by the journal Elsevier, and it was a 2017 report called Gender in the Global Research Landscape. And it revealed more positive outcomes for Japanese women who are transitory migrants. In other words, gender diplomats who went abroad for research and study. What the report indicated is that women in Japan spend 4 to 5 times, and there's other research that shows this too, on domestic tasks. And yet they were able to author more scholarly papers on average than their male counterparts. This was found to be exceptional across all comparator countries and regions. The highest citations were associated with these transitory migrators. That is, women who are able to cross national boundaries are able to have their work cited more. And the report said the following: Japan showed, quote, a high proportion of women among researchers leaving the country, and a low proportion of women among researchers entering the country. Over 20 years between 96 and 2015, women represented only 1 in 5 researchers in Japan across 27 subject areas. Women in the STEM fields is the lowest in the Asia-Pacific region. Women in South Korea represent 18%, while Japan has the lowest representation at 15%. In this study, Japan was singled out in the Asia-Pacific region as promoting gender equity through government-led initiatives that we've heard about, from Making Women Shine to Womenomics, to the Japan Science and Technology Agency, JST, that established an Office for Diversity and Inclusion to promote gender equity and mentoring, along with the country's hosting of the Gender Summit 10. And there was a quote from Miyoko Watanabe, Deputy Executive Director of JST, who said, if we look globally, Japanese women are doing better outside Japan than inside Japan in terms of the proportion of female specialists and managers. So my working theory, and this is very much a work in progress, is that the most opportunities for women to shine lie outside the country, not at home. And Japan pays an inordinate amount of lip service and attention to the gender gap and to women's empowerment. Most of the attention focuses on women's contributions or lack thereof to economic growth, as I said, Womenomics, or to participating in government and politics. Some attention, but very little, is paid to the role of women in international relations and diplomacy. And there is a paucity of research on the role of younger women, as well as their older role models as gender diplomats. Now, how I define gender diplomacy, it recognizes the power of gender analysis and gender equality promotion in international relations policy. And I believe very strongly this is an understudied trend in a wide swath of the world, from East Asia to the United States, where the majority of study abroad participants are female. Gender diplomacy is a very personal and professional pursuit as I seek to ways to make my research and writing contribute to narrowing the gap, the gender gap in international relations and specifically diplomacy. My own conversion to measuring outcomes of gender and diplomacy through educational exchange is a result of my exchange experience as a doctoral. I was a Fulbright student to Germany, but also I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the cultural mediation roles of foreign Fulbright scholars in the US. But it's one thing to work toward improving the status of women in Europe or North America, or advocating a feminist foreign policy in Sweden or Canada. It's a much steeper climb to advocate for lifting the status of marginalized women in places like democratic Japan and South Korea, two countries along with the China, where I've been doing research and teaching in public diplomacy for well over a decade. In Japan, I'm well aware of my observational role as an outside person, also known as a gaijin, and I have outsider person eyes. But this vantage point can be very useful. Many Japanese women have opened up to me frankly and critically about the frustrations they endure as women in patriarchal society. They especially feel familial and societal pressure to do it all. They are expected to have a career for at least long enough to find a mate, have a family life, and hold down another job as housewife with its unpaid domestic responsibilities and caring for aging parents. This is not to overlook pressures that exist for men in patriarchal society. Many men in Japan no longer seek lifetime employment that requires long working hours and mandatory after-work socializing or drinking parties with work peers and supervisors. And they too are giving up in larger numbers on having it all, including marriage and family. But even if these, and statistically speaking, you all may be aware, but in Japan now, the unmarried rate has risen quite dramatically since my first trips in the 90s, where we referenced the Christmas cake parable. You'll have to ask me about that, about when women are marriageable. It's related to the number 25, as in December 25th. But nowadays, the unmarried rate in Japan has reached 23% for men and 14% for women, as men's income has dropped in a decades-long slow growth economy. But even if they never marry, men still feel pressure to remain the stereotypical breadwinner. And the Japanese corporate structure career ladder requires that Japanese men stay put in order to move up the work ranks. When I say they stay put, that means they stay in Japan. So women, it seems, are less indispensable and can take advantage of a foreign sojourn during their formal education. My faculty colleague, Kumiko Nomoto, wrote in her book, Too Few Women at the Top, The Persistent Inequality of Women in Japan, that women's marginalism has been the default position since post-war Japan. Japanese women's lower status in employment, which is the most publicly visible indicator of women's economic value, has persisted since the American occupation period, including the right to vote. And Nomoto and I agree that the low status of women in Japan is not just an economic hurdle typified by Shinzo Abe's Womenomic efforts, but it also has high hurdles to overcome ideological barriers. As I wrote in my book, Japan's Information War, women in Japan remain the most underutilized natural resource in the country. 40 years ago, women made up 12% of the college population in Japanese universities. And today, their numbers are nearly half. But the percentage of women middle managers in that same period rose from just 1 to 5%. The picture of the boss or supervisor in Japan, much less professor, remains masculinized. Even Japan's top university, Todai, University of Tokyo, which feeds the country, its researchers and diplomats, has about an 80% male student body. And this was according to Motoko Rich, publishing in the New York Times in 2019. At that time, she said, among 7 publicly funded national institutions, women make up just over 1/4 of undergraduates. At the exclusive private universities, Keio and Waseda, women are little over 1/3. I think in the interest of time, I need to kind of move along here, and I'm just going to go a little bit more into gender diplomacy. The reason I'm focusing on that is that so much of the research on gender and diplomacy sort of separates the two. And when you look at IR, a lot of the political science and IR programs look at gender in a neutral context. And so, of course, this relates to how we do research and how we view sex-defined roles. But with the gender diplomat, what I like about it is that it's putting the emphasis on the ground up, not the top down. So much of the research on gender and diplomacy is looking at how many more women ambassadors can we have. Well, the likelihood of somebody becoming an ambassador, much less a female ambassador, is so very low. The difference with the gender diplomat is that potentially every person who's been on an exchange can adopt this role. It's not a role that you may want to take on, but there's no question that with the Japanese women, many of them who return to Japan and speak to me tell me about their conversion, their transformation, their emancipation, if you will, not only in language, but also in how they view their roles as change agents in the world. So the trouble with the Womenomics theory in Japan, which has received so much attention, is not only its hyper focus on the executive level participation, it's also what is being left out of the story. Scant attention is paid to the role of women as both state and non-state actors in international relations and diplomacy. Even less attention, as I said earlier, acknowledges the role of younger women and older role models, those women who traveled abroad years ago and who are now working up and at higher ranks. They should be functioning as a mentor to these younger women. So finally, I'll just add that this is very much an understudied trend in a wide swath of the world, from East Asia to the United States, where the majority of study abroad participants are female. And I hope that being online today and having this discussion, that I can encourage more people to actually address this and to conduct more research. I'm in the process of doing interviews with younger students, and Kumiko Nomoto is talking to women executives who've had the international exchange experience. So thank you. Right on 20 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. Great time management. All right, Emil, how about we just jump right into.
Thank you so much, Professor Snow, for this interesting talk. This which raises many like questions and provokes many thoughts. I'm of course familiar with your work. I mean, from my PhD education, your work on propaganda and on public diplomacy. I'm happy to hear about this new focus of you, the focus, moving into or connecting these areas to gender issues. There are, of course, a lot of reasons to study foreign policy, public diplomacy from a gender perspective in a world where some states position themselves or are position themselves as feminists or conducting a feminist foreign policy. Other states are promoting, or positioning themselves as conservative actors, promoting a traditional family values. So how gender has become so explicit. I mean, feminist research has shown that gender has always been, has always been an important kind of has always been undergirding international affairs. But in many ways, we'd say Putin, Trump, Sweden's and Canada's feminist foreign policy, it's become more of an explicit issue. I find it interesting that this concept of gender diplomat, how, as I understand you correctly, you're not only speaking of diplomats in the traditional sense, in a that is people employed in the foreign service, but rather anyone who has been, as you say, women who have been abroad. Could you say a little bit more about, I mean, what do you mean, in what way do you mean that they are, or do you see these women as diplomats? Who are they? I mean, who are they negotiating with? Who is their target audience, if you wish? I mean, what are their form?
Well, you know, as in public diplomacy 2.0, or the emergence of public diplomacy, which has become a really hot topic, there's a great deal of focus on non-state actors. So I'm really purposely getting away from the Foreign Service and the official messengers of a government. So in this case, I probably reference that not every woman who goes abroad, or even young man who goes abroad, is going to want to integrate gender into this. But specific to Japan, I think it works well as an integrated concept related to this feminization of study abroad, because I didn't know, Emil, until I went to Japan, what a high percentage of the high school and university level study abroad participants are female. And then I began to link that to, in part, this being more dispensable, that women really, if say a young man goes abroad and he's also wanting to go up the traditional trajectory at a Japanese company, going abroad could serve as a weak point on his resume. You have to sort of explain why did you go abroad? But for these young women I talked to, they felt like it wouldn't hurt their chances in the marketplace, because the expectations were already lower than they were for their male counterparts. So for them, it became a bit of this personal self-realization. I want to go abroad to learn English or to study another language, but also to find my voice. Many of them had never been away from home or outside of Japan, and they would tell me how difficult it was initially having to do things on their own. Some of those who went to the US or Australia, where they had to be so self-sufficient. They often do homestays with families, and they would say it was hard to criticize something. If they were in an uncomfortable living situation, they might just move out and try to find something else, because they didn't know how to handle that interpersonal conflict in a second language. So ultimately, though, depending on the length of time they were there, and again, this is at the very beginning, doing personal interviews and just talking to them about their experience. I started to notice a pattern of self-confidence, of hearing one voice speak in the classroom, because the traditional Japanese classroom, at least K through 12, and I would say even into the university, is that the sensei is the sort of all-knowing. You don't question the sensei, so you often learn passively. And yet when they go abroad, they're often in the Western classroom where they might be called on. What do you think? What's your opinion? So this was something brand new. And again, this can cross with men and women. But I was focused on linking this to trying to increase the movement of Japan to become a more gender equal society. You've got to address this resource, not only women in general, but also women who have been abroad. They're not asked about their experience. They just return. And unless somebody specifically asks them about what did you learn, what did you get out of that, how is that going to shape your future plans professionally, personally, then we just don't know. But what I'm hearing from often Japanese executives, high level, and these are most often men, is that they go around the world and they find these incredibly capable, almost like superwomen Japanese. And they ask them, will you ever return to Japan? And more often than not, it's no, Japan doesn't have anything for me. I've left that behind me. They see themselves as a global change agent. And that is not something that is readily embraced in Japan at this time. They are in the process of globalizing, but this notion of a shared identity, that you can be both Japanese and globally minded, is not particularly the norm. I once surveyed in my classroom, I said to my students, all Japanese students, maybe I had one or two foreigners, and I said, you're given your dream job, but here's the catch. It's outside of Japan. Will you take it? And I said, don't think too long, but just tell me yes or no. When I went around the room, there was a young man who said no, and I said, why? And he said, where will I find the kind of Japanese food I have at home? And the only ones who said, yeah, I'd take it in a heartbeat were the international students. There was a lot of sort of sense of conflict. Can I really do this? But for those who've been abroad, you can see the transformation. It's not that different from my Fulbright experiences. We would talk about how it's so life-changing. So in a way, I'm linking what I was looking at 30 years ago to what I'm looking at now. But a lot of this sort of grew just from being a participant observer and just asking people who had been abroad, what changed about you? Have you thought about that? And then they would open up more. But a lot of it had to do with finding their voice.
Yeah, interesting. A short follow-up there. Would they, I mean, have you encountered any? It seems, I mean, according to what you say, that most of these women have their impressions have been mostly, say, positive, or saying that, yeah, finding their voice. But did anyone voice, say, critique of what they encountered outside of Japan, or became more critical, or so negative?
That's been harder to tease out, because, for instance, if they had gone to America and had become more critical, they may not necessarily tell me. I may not be the right person to talk to about that, but they did share that it was difficult. It was a difficult time in many respects. And in some senses, and this emerges in a lot of the exchange literature, if they look at Japanese students abroad, there's often this emphasis on making friends, or I didn't make enough friends. And that is something that in my own research, looking at Fulbright scholars, foreign Fulbright scholars in the US, if they could connect with and build a social network, and we defined it differently in the 90s, but if they could make a friendship network with multiculturals, with a diverse population, and they also just had a connection to a family, or they had a core network, they performed better. They believed that they were going to perform better in the classroom. And so for the Japanese, when I talk to them about this gender role, they say that their experience of study abroad is difficult, but in terms of gender, they have this feeling, in a way, they know that they confront this very stereotypical image of a woman, a Japanese woman, when they go abroad. And so they return to Japan, and they're aware that they are sort of slowly kind of taking down that stereotype of the uber feminine, domestic goddess that we often hear about and see discussed over the decades. So they very much want to be taken more as individuals, and some will have a positive experience, some will have a negative. But I will tell you, all the women's conferences I go to, where they have the champion women executives, Japanese women executives, almost to a person, they've been abroad for part of their education, undergraduate, graduate. So they need to connect with these younger women. And that's why I call it gender diplomat, because it's grassroots, it's a citizen diplomat, it's non-elite, it's not putting pressure on somebody to be an expert in foreign policy. Although you may be asked about Japan's foreign policy, are you prepared to address that? But not all of them will want to enact this role. But I do see it as a possible extension for some of them to feel comfortable with addressing these stereotypical images. I mean, we all, I live with a stereotypical image of an American woman abroad. So it's something I'm very comfortable talking about, but not everybody would be comfortable with that. You have to really ask the person and find out on your own. So this is very interpersonal, informal at this stage of my research.
Can I ask another question, Stephanie, or should we allow the question? Thank you. Feminist research on international relations has shown that how gender equality has become a marker of status, of international status. Professor Ann Towns writes about how gender equality has become this kind of marker, how states are judged and ranked internationally according to how they perform on gender equality or according to how they treat their women. Would you say that this international norm of gender equality plays a role here? I mean, does it to what extent is this a role of this international norm or international pressure or international expectation to, say, improve Japan's international status? And to what extent is this more, a bottom-up grassroots process? Do you understand the question?
Well, I think I do. And I mean, I've been studying Japan's nation brand, and Japan's telling its story to the world. And a big part of that, of my research, has coincidentally with Shinzo Abe's second term in office. So the whole Womenomics and addressing gender inequality has become the big buzz in Japan. It's just that it's been a little frustrating because a lot of it is, how to become a woman at the top. It's all about getting to that C-suite, that corporate corner suite, or becoming an elected member of the Diet. And it's so remote for most people in their everyday thinking around the world. I mean, that's so remote, that's so rare. And so that's why I wanted to address gender and diplomacy, or gender diplomacy, from the level of how we could all begin to talk about this and confronting stereotypes. And we certainly do this a lot in literature and research on race and other intersections. We talk a lot about identity. So I suppose it's more about identity. it's not really something that's been part of the discussion amongst the executives or like the Abe administration, much less the Suga administration. But I think for Japan, it's been embarrassing to be sort of going down in the rankings, even though there's been a lot more talk and rhetoric about gender. It's not improving in the rankings, and it's not as if a lot of people are buying into that you can have it all. So with Womenomics, it's, you know, work, but also get married, also have children, and yet you have these growing rates of people who either delay marriage, maybe never have children, and maybe never marry. So there's definitely some type of rebellion going on, and it's rather a silent rebellion. But I mean, we don't really talk a lot about feminism in Japan, or at least I don't. And again, I'm not a gender researcher per se. I have a general degree in international relations, and I only came to this through my experience of seeing the underutilization of very well qualified women who were, again, more of the messengers. And it reminded me of working at the US Information Agency, which was predominantly female. And we were the messengers of America's story to the world. We were not the decision makers, much less the foreign policy analysts. That was at the Department of State. So I was aware of that dichotomy even in Washington, D.C. And what happens is that when you're put in that role of being more of a messenger, you can be easily sidelined and you don't speak up for yourself. So I think the attractive part to the gender diplomacy is to look at it perhaps as a possibility for training or talking to women across generations. I've said for years, there are the 3 G's in Japan: generation, gender, and globalization. And even with the Tokyo Olympics this summer, I didn't really see that narrative come alive. So what you often hear about related to Japan vis-a-vis gender is when something goes wrong. And then it makes headlines around the world, a sexist comment or something that people can kind of giggle about, but it doesn't really change anything. If anything, it probably increases a sense of a little pushback. You know, aren't we talking enough about women? And I think there is something to that. You know, the New York Times just published a piece about the decline of men going to the universities in the United States. So there are a lot more women now going to the university. So we can expect there will be pushback because we're really making gender roles and, you know, traditional family values, everything's being turned on its head, isn't it? So all I'm advocating for is that we think of, you know, we think a little bit about the role that an international student can play in terms of being a citizen diplomat. And then in the case of Japan with women going abroad, they are confronted, like it or not, based on gender, because they're confronted by it within Japan too. I've been told many times in Japan that the ideal woman in the world is a Japanese woman. Have you heard that before, Emil?
Sure.
I mean, these little, you know, legends, they do change people's minds about how they respond to people.
All right. I think it's a fantastic conversation going on here. And we would love to have the audience come in with their questions. So we already have one question, as the others might be thinking a little bit about formulating and writing down their question. So let's start here with Dr. Anders Larsson from Uppsala University. Thank you for a fascinating talk. Increasing the number of women in the workforce and women in politics has been a talking point of the dominant LDP for at least 20 years now, but especially after 2013, when Abe started to focus on building a platform of Womenomics, as we talked about. Today, we have a number of prominent, strong women speaking for conservative politics. including Sakurai Yoshihiko and Koike Yuriko. Yet at the same time, there's a clear focus in conservative politics on traditional family values and on increasing the birth rate in stable nuclear or multi-generation households. There seems to me to be a tension here within the LDP between conservative values and the necessity to increase the number of women in the workforce and in leadership roles. Do you agree with this description of LDP politics? Do you believe that Japan under LDP leadership is likely to solve the situation with two seemingly mutually exclusive goals, or could it only happen following a regime change? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I didn't realize how dominant the LDP was until I moved to Japan, because I was not a Japanologist. I wasn't even a Japan watcher. I went on these exchanges in the 90s, and then after Obama was elected, the State Department and the US Embassy in Tokyo invited me to come over and talk about Obama's Asia pivot. So there was a 16-year gap. Sounds like the 16-minute gap, with Watergate. But for me, it was a 16-year gap, and I returned in 2010. And then it came to my mind that there's sort of a stranglehold on politics. There is this discussion of women in politics, but by and large, yes, the women we see at least go into politics are more of the traditional, sometimes very far right type women, because the ones who are too progressive, and there are some out there, but they're with lesser known parties that don't really have a whole lot of impact. Those progressive ones remain very sidelined. So what I've noticed at the women's conferences where they discuss Womenomics is that the women executives who are traveling, certainly pre-COVID, were always sort of on the go and traveling internationally, because they reached such a high level in their company, they were the ones that I thought could speak freer about the realities of the norms and the values in Japan. And so I'm really pinning my hopes on change with not only those women executives at the top, but as I said, that's not enough. That's the whole thing about gender diplomats. We don't know what's going to happen to some of these younger exchange returnees, these exchange participants. And what I'm arguing is we need to track these people, some of them, to see where they end up. Are some of them going to go into industry? Are they going to start their own jobs? A number of them who've been abroad have told me that they never thought that they would start their own company until they lived abroad, because they encountered a lot more sort of entrepreneurials who would discuss with them, why not just start your company? And there is an entrepreneurial community growing in Japan, but it needs to grow more. I think the problem with the LDP is that it kind of sucks up all the oxygen in the room. And so we need more voices. And for some of these who've been abroad, they need to be making their voices heard more, not only in writing op-eds, but also in being connected. And that's where the role of the university comes in. I think the US university is poor with this. It's not just a criticism of Japan, but we do a poor job with really trying to learn from those who return from abroad, and we don't really follow up with them. I think Rotary International does a better job. There are some exchange programs where they build in that giving back portion. And I think that would be very valuable in this case to link those who are interested with some of their older mentors who've also been abroad. Get these people into one room and talk about that experience and maybe start creating a network because it's an altogether different outlook. When you have a global outlook, you're not so tied to just one country. You often have norms and values of sustainability. And at my university in Japan, we emphasize all the time the Sustainable Development Goals. But what we don't often do is link it to one's personal experience. And so that's what I'm trying to do with this idea of a gender diplomat, is just talk to somebody at a personal level. And the gender aspect comes in because of the disproportionate number of women in the study abroad experience.
Thank you. We have another question and a feedback effect. So thank you for a fascinating talk. How do we move beyond giving women a seat at the table or essentializing their mere presence in spaces of power? In what way can we make sure gender diplomats as concept is not rendered synonymous to women diplomats, or that gender diplomacy is not synonymized with only numerical representation?
Right. Well, I do work in Korea, in China, so I'm not just limiting this to Japan. And it's not even really American based. It's something that occurred to me when I moved to Japan. And last year I was teaching at Schwarzman College, which is based at Tsinghua University in Beijing. And I had students from all over the world in my class in public diplomacy. And I did the gender diplomacy talk as an extra on a Saturday. And nearly all of the students joined that. So there was something that was resonating with them. And I don't think it's US centric. In fact, I don't think it even has to be US centric. It has to come from within. So I'm not writing about, oh, this is my idea and I want to apply it to Japan. What I'm noting is just an observation that the incredible people I've met have this shared experience of study abroad. And they will often talk about how it transformed them in some way. And it led to the people that they reached out to. It led to the jobs that they applied for. In the case of Japan, we hear constantly when you go to events having to do with gender, Sasakawa Foundation addresses this, that women who go abroad, Japanese women, often end up in international development. They work at the UN or they want to go to Geneva. They have this interest in international change and development. That could be very different in Korea and in China. I'm not sure because we just haven't been investigating this. As I said, there's already existing literature, not a whole lot, but existing literature looking at gender and diplomacy. But historically, because we've looked at gender as such a neutral concept in international relations, we sort of cancel it out early on, and certainly related to security, national interests, issues. We don't even go there because they're seen as more of kind of power politics, a la Hans Morgenthau, which was like my Bible, in international relations 30 years ago. And I really came about this more recently because I wrote to Joseph Nye, who coined the term soft power. And I wrote to him from a very personal place that when I read his most recent book on morals and foreign policy, I quickly looked at the index and I looked at the chapter on FDR, and there was nothing about Eleanor Roosevelt. And yet I knew that a friend of mine, Blanche Wiesen-Cook, had published a 3-volume history of ER, a lot of which had to do with foreign policy and international human rights and the founding of the UN, and starting her own column, writing her own column. So Joe Nye wrote back and was very supportive and said, I've done my part on soft power. Now I encourage you to look at this from a gender feminist perspective. So this is, again, a work in progress. You're asking me a tough question about where do we go? This is why I came to Sweden, because to the Japanese, the Nordic countries are the example to the rest of the world. You're so much further along, but I think we're all kind of making our way slowly because, as I said, there's still a lot of pushback. People are uncomfortable with a lot of change, particularly at the level of something that seems very fixed. And it's maybe not so fixed for people anymore, but I'm talking about gender, of course, or race or ethnicity or what have you. These are things that are really being kind of challenged and redefined. And for many people, that's pretty scary. You know, that's not the world they were born into. So this isn't anything too radical or revolutionary here. It's just getting at a way as an add-on. When I did the Fulbright program, I came back and I said, no matter what I do the rest of my life, at least I will have been a Fulbright scholar. So for me, that really mattered to me and my self-worth and my self-identity. So when I talk to women about, you realize, you know, you were enacting a role of a gender diplomat, or I just talk to them in general about their experience, I see them sort of, you know, respond very favorably to it because they just see it as something, as an add-on that maybe could be helpful in promoting mutual understanding and understanding where people are coming from as a point of conversation.
Great, thank you. Next question we have from Anna Enbuske, who writes, in 2012, I attended a seminar at the Swedish Embassy in Tokyo, where a visiting professor showed results from a study that foreign companies employing female graduates, giving them opportunities to climb within the company before leaving the labor market or not. That was not the case in Japanese companies, where they were employed according to gender stereotypes. Do you have any comments on these results?
Yeah, actually, I brought this up last week. I gave a talk on gender perspectives on diplomacy at Lund University. And I brought up the observation that a friend of mine shared with me, Glenn Fukushima. And he told me this many years ago, but he had attended a seminar at Stanford. And it was with executives from Japanese companies, and they were talking about how difficult it was to place a lot of the men who are sent abroad to the subsidiaries. They weren't working out. Many were returning to Japan because they had not gained this independence. They went from the family home where they were taken care of by their mother. And then, of course, if they married, which pretty much all of them were married, they were also taken care of. They had that kind of learned dependency. And the companies realized that the women were perhaps better prepared for going abroad because they were prepared to take care of a home and they were prepared to be multitaskers. And just like I said earlier about women doing, on average in Japan, it's up to 4 hours a day of unpaid domestic labor. And on top of that, though, somehow many Japanese women researchers are producing more citations and papers. So they've learned over time to have a lot of sort of balls up in the air that they have to manage. And so there has to be that recognition. And so far, I don't think Womenomics has recognized that enough. It's been very much sort of one way and modeled on the Japanese salaryman model. And both men and women in Japan tell me that they're not really into that model anymore because it doesn't have the quality of life that they're seeking. So this is a conversation that we can have across the spectrum and talk about work-life balance and also just really what kind of a life do you want to build for yourself?
Okay, great. Nancy, we have time for one more question, but we have to make sure we stop on time. So this is now from Ines Hagström, who wants to ask, how big do you think the generational gap is between younger and older women in Japan in terms of attitudes towards women's participation in society? Are younger women more actively promoting feminism in Japan, or is it older women sometimes who are more active in this regard?
Right, that's a great question. I haven't really studied that closely enough, But I've been aware, though, if I hear anything about the older generation, and this is men and women, there's a sense that they really benefited from the old system, and they're, pretty well taken care of, and they have a good pension. And the deeper levels of insecurity come from the younger ones or those who might be single head of household. And maybe it's a woman with a child. And so they have a lot less time to really think about maybe feminism. Maybe they view that as sort of an indulgence. So I haven't talked to older women about feminism, but my belief is just tangentially that there are feminist writers, and the ones that I've heard about are often older, but I would hope that they are reaching out to the younger counterparts. By and large, when I talk to young scholars at Japanese universities, some of them are foreign scholars as well, they tell me that, gender and feminism isn't particularly well received. But again, I'm just learning this anecdotally, and it could be that when it comes to really moving up the ladder, you want to go into economics, or you want to study security, as I said. Womenomics, there's a reason why we have that term. It actually has been around for 20 years. Kathy Matsui, a Japanese American woman, executive at Goldman Sachs, coined that term. And so then Abe adopted that. But I mean, it really misses a large part of the landscape of storytelling, and across generation, and across, again, gender, and also this globalization that Japan is so fervently interested in.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Right, we're nearly at the end of our seminar, so I would just like to take the opportunity to thank our audience for being here, and hope that you will come back to the next Japan seminar on Stockholm Seminar in Japan. But of course, I would like to thank in particular Professor Snow and Dr. Edenborg. Thank you so much for your time and your conversation. And I wish you a very pleasant day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.